If you hadn't noticed, I'm a knight.
Hello, I'm Knight Jake, host of the Mighty Fortress radio podcast. Hello and welcome to Knight Jake Speaks. I am your host, Knight Jake. On the last episode of Knight Jake Speaks, we did the State of Division, a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland, Part A, which was from the years 1838 through to 1900. If you're interested in learning of that history, you can go and check out my video on Part A, where I talk about Lutheranism in Queensland from the 1800s. For this episode, we're going to be doing Part B, which is going to be the years 1900 through to 1966. For those Lutherans in Australia, you'll know that the year of 1966 was the famous union of the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, which then formed into the Lutheran Church of Australia, known as the LCA. In Part A of this series, we went through Lutheranism in the 19th century, and now we're going to talk about Lutheranism in the 20th and 21st centuries. But because the state of Lutheranism in Queensland in the 20th century and the 21st century is very complicated and very lengthy and detailed, I've decided to break up the 20th century into two parts. So in this part, we're going to be doing 1900 to 1966, when the LCA union took place, and in Part C, we're going to look at the side effects of this union. And so in Part C, we'll look at the years from 1966 up to the present day of 2017. So, for those who are interested in learning the history of Lutheranism in Queensland from the 1800s, do check out my video Part A. Now we're just going to start off with Part B in the year 1900. To begin the 20th century, we need to return to the incident at Christchurch Lutheran Church of Highfields, which was a member congregation of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, also known as the ELSA. Following the split of the congregation in 1899, which I mentioned in Part A of this series, dissension continued in the Christchurch Lutheran congregation over the fellowship between the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. In 1900, the congregation would break away from their pastor, Pastor Backen, and would return to the synod known as the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. In 1901, Pastor Backen would then return to the ELSA congregation at Nini, Victoria, from whence he came before he came to Queensland. Now, it would appear at this stage that with the loss of the Highfields congregation, the ELSA would lose their foothold in Queensland. However, this was not the case, as the ELSA was able to maintain a foothold in Queensland thanks to the faithful efforts of Pastor Nichtele, known as the pioneer missionary of the ELSA in Queensland. In 1899, Pastor Nichtele was ordained by Pastor Backen and Pastor Peters. Pastor Peters was the district president of the ELSA's Victorian district, or as it was known, the ELSA's Eastern District. It did not take the name Victorian District until 1936. Pastor Nichtele was installed as the ELSA missionary to Queensland. Pastor Nichtele worked endlessly to establish 6 ELSA congregations in the state. These were the congregations at Headington Hill, at Greenwood, Evergreen, Bismarck, which is now called Mactalang, Tevitaville and Coombia. In 1909, Pastor Nichtele left Queensland and was called to the congregation at Tabor, Victoria. However, Nichtele was succeeded by other mission pastors of the ELSA who were just as energetic and mission-minded as he had been. The main mission goal of the ELSA was to seek out and minister to former ELSA families who had migrated from the southern states to Queensland. These Lutheran families had formerly been members of the ELSA when they lived in the southern states of Australia, but after moving to Queensland during the 1800s, they were unable to retain membership in the ELSA as there were no ELSA congregations in the state. Thus, they had turned their membership over to either the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland or the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, most of them going to the United German and Scandinavian Synod. However, now that the ELSA had managed to establish a firm foothold in Queensland, many of these members could once again return to the ELSA Synod. Thus, the ELSA flourished in Queensland and grew rapidly. Many young members and congregations of the other synods in Queensland would leave their own synod and join the ELSA in order to receive services in English, as the ELSA was presently the only Lutheran synod in Queensland providing the divine service in English. The United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland at this point in time only had divine service in German. This meant that many of the youth who'd become anglicised sought English service and thus headed over and joined the ELSA. In 1909, the St. John's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Albany would join the ELSA. And in 1911, the ELSA had grown so large in Queensland that they decided to leave the Eastern District of the ELSA, also known as the Victorian District of the ELSA, and form the Queensland District, following the example of the New South Wales congregations, which had split from the Eastern District in 1908 to form the ELSA's New South Wales District. As for the Victorian congregations, they would continue to be known as the ELSA Eastern District until 1936, when they decided to change the name to the ELSA Victorian District. As for the desired union between the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia and the United German Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, as I discussed in part A of this series, the two synods would continue to dialogue for decades. In 1899, Pastor Peters, the district president of the ELSA Victorian District, or Eastern District, travelled to Queensland and met with Pastor Hewer of the United German and Scandinavian Synod. Pastor Hewer was one of the 4 Hermannsburg seminarians sent to Queensland by the ELSA in 1883, which I mentioned in part A of this series. The two pastors, Pastor Peter of the ELSA and Pastor Hewer of the United German and Scandinavian Synod, met and discussed many things, including the possibility of a union. However, discussions fell silent for nearly a decade until the year of 1909, when the Queensland congregations of the ELSA met with the United German and Scandinavian Synod to discuss union. Hopes were once again very high for union, but the discussions were eventually broken off. In the year of 1910, the United German and Scandinavian Synod entered into fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, commonly known as the Emmanuel Synod, to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church Federation, commonly referred to as the Church Federation. In 1912, the ELSA approached the United German and Scandinavian Synod in another attempt to establish a union between the two synods. Discussions resulted in no tangible result. In 1920 and 1921, the ELSA would again try for a union with the United German and Scandinavian Synod, but no agreements could ever be reached. As for the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, the synod would experience its own division, leading to the rise of a 4th Lutheran synod in the state of Queensland. The conflict began in 1911 at a pastors' conference of the Queensland Synod at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, Beenleigh. Here, Pastor Carl Egerot Truers made a controversial proposal that the Queensland Synod declare fellowship with the Evangelical State Church of Prussia, commonly known as the Union Church. If you watch my former video, part A of A Brief History of Lutheranism in Queensland, there I discuss the history of the Union Church and the Old Lutheran Schism. Now, when we consider the history of the Union Church and the Old Lutheran Schism of 1835, it would seem almost unthinkable that an Australian Lutheran pastor would suggest a union between the Union Church and an Australian Lutheran Synod. However, many of the pastors from the Queensland Synod were not Old Lutherans, as were the South Australian Lutherans or the Hermannsburg pastors. The Queensland Synod had been made up of pastors from the Gosnell Theological College and the Evangelical Mission Society of Basel, commonly called the Basel Mission Society. These Gosner Basil pastors all came from the Union Church of Prussia, and thus it was not unthinkable that one of them would consider fellowship between the Union Church and the Australian Church. The Synod voted against Truers's proposal. However, despite the Queensland Synod's decision, Pastor Truers publicly declared that his congregation, the St Andrew's Lutheran Congregation of North Brisbane, still intended to seek fellowship with the Union Church. In the following year of 1912, the Queensland Synod met at St Paul's Lutheran Church, Hatton Vale, for a synodical conference. Here, Pastor Truers publicly announced that he and the St Andrew's Congregation of North Brisbane had denied the Synod's decision and had declared fellowship with the Union Church. St Andrew's also offered a new proposal asking that each congregation be given the right to individually declare fellowship with the Union Church. Thus, some congregations of the Queensland Synod would be in fellowship with the Church of Prussia, whereas some of the congregations wouldn't be in fellowship with the Church of Prussia. This led to a very heated debate. The Synod rejected St Andrew's proposal, and they also declined to grant them permission for their fellowship with the Union Church of Prussia. The Synod stated that they wished to uphold their connections with the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of Australia, commonly called the General Synod, and therefore did not desire to cause offence to the other Australian Lutheran synods by having an affiliation with the Union Church of Prussia. This led to a withdrawal of 5 pastors and their congregations from the Queensland Synod. This group would then later be joined by the St John's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Charter Towers, which, as I mentioned in Part A, was already in fellowship with the Union Church since 1896. This group of pastors and congregations would be joined by a Lutheran missionary in Samoa, and thus they decided to call themselves the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australasia. In total, this Australasian Synod had 7 pastors, 6 of them in Queensland and the 1 missionary in Samoa. They also had 7 congregations, the one at North Brisbane, one at Toowoomba, one at Maryborough, Hatton Vale, one at Hillside, which is now called Kalana, one at Lockrose, and one at Charter Towers. They also had their mission in Samoa. Now, while this synod had been formed due to a mutual desire for fellowship with the Union Church of Prussia, and while the congregations of the Australasian Synod did seek fellowship with Prussia, by the time the synod came to an end, only the congregations at St Andrew's, North Brisbane and St John's Charter Towers had officially formed fellowship with the Union Church. The Australasian Synod was short-lived due to the outbreak of World War I from the years of 1914 to 1999. In 1914, World War I, or the Great War as it was called back then, broke out, and many Lutheran pastors in Australia were considered to be German spies. Since the Australasian Synod was connected with the Union Church of Prussia, their entire organisation came under suspicion. 4 of the 6 pastors were interned during this war period. This caused the Australasian Synod to collapse as an organisation, and their congregations became independent. Pastor Schaffert of the St John's Congregation at Charters Towers was deported to Germany in 1915, and the congregation at Charter Towers closed and sold its property to the Anglicans. As for Pastor Truers of North Brisbane, he was deported to Germany in 1918. Once World War I ended, things quieted down in Queensland. 4 of the former Australasian congregations, Toowoomba, Kalana, Lockrose and Hatton Vale, returned to the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. As for Maryborough and North Brisbane, in order to discuss their history, we need to discuss the second largest union in the Australian history, the 1921 amalgamation of the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. In order to understand the history of the 1921 amalgamation, we need to look at the history leading up to this amalgamation. Therefore, we need to go back to 1846 at the Bethany Schism between Pastor August Ludwig Christian Carvel and Pastor Gotthard Daniel Fritzer. Pastor Carville's congregations would go on to form the Light Path Langmile Synod, while the congregations of Pastor Fritzer would form the Bethany Lobethal Synod, later renamed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of South Australia, commonly called the South Australian Synod, and later renamed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, commonly known as the ELSA. For the sake of ease, I'm going to be referring to Fritz's congregation by the commonly known name ELSA, rather than referring to them as the Bethany Lobethal Synod or the South Australian Synod. In the year of 1860, Pastor Carville passed away, and it would be followed by Pastor Fritz's death in 1863. With the death of these two pastors, the Light Path Langmile Synod and the ELSA were able to find some reconciliation. In 1860, a group broke off of the Light Path Langmile Synod and formed the Tanunda Light Path Synod. In 1866, the Tanunda Light Path Synod entered into fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, which had been formed in 1856 by Pastor Matthias Goeth. In 1864, the Light Path Langmile Synod and the ELSA joined to form the Confessional Union, a fellowship but not a merger. This lasted only 10 years, for in the year of 1874, the Light Path Langmile Synod and the Tanunda Light Path Synod would merge and form the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, commonly called the Emmanuel Synod. Due to the former fellowship between the Tanunda Light Path Synod and the Victorian Synod, the Emmanuel Synod decided to retain fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. The ELSA disapproved of this fellowship due to the Victorian Synod practice of calling non-Lutheran pastors. Thus, the ELSA dissolved the Confessional Union, breaking fellowship with the Emmanuel Synod. In 1876, the Emmanuel Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria formed the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of Australia, commonly called the General Synod. This again was a fellowship and not a merger. However, in 1884, the Emmanuel Synod decided to leave the General Synod because of the Victorian Synod's practice of calling non-Lutheran pastors. The same reason the ELSA dissolved the Confessional Union. At this point in time, a small group who desired to remain in the General Synod would break away from the Emmanuel Synod. This group would call themselves the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis. In 1889, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland would join the General Synod. As for the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, they would remain independent until 1910, when the United German and Scandinavian Synod entered into fellowship with the Emmanuel Synod to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church Federation, commonly called the Church Federation, once again a fellowship but not a merger. The Church Federation had a desire for peace, and in 1912 the Church Federation invited the General Synod, made up of the Victorian Synod, the Queensland Synod, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, to meet with them at St. Stephen's Lutheran Church, Adelaide, South Australia, on the 22nd and 23rd of February 1912 to discuss fellowship. A further meeting was held at St. John's Lutheran Congregation, Matoa, Victoria, in May of 1913. In order to help negotiations, the two Queensland Synods, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, met on May 29, 1913 for a joint pastors' conference. As mentioned previously, the ELSA attempted unity with the United German and Scandinavian Synod in the years of 1912, 1920 and 1921. Nothing came of these attempts, and as of 1921, the ELSA's plans for unity with the United German and Scandinavian Synod would all be lost. World War I had hindered the attempts of the German Synod and the Church Federation to form any kind of fellowship. But in June 1920, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis decided to join the Church Federation. The Church Federation would therefore now be made up of 4 Lutheran Synods: the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. However, a further union would be hindered as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod remained aloof and did not join the Church Federation. In March of 1921, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, the Emmanuel Synod, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Bases voted to merge into the new United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia, or commonly known as the ULCA. This time, it was a merger and not merely a fellowship of synods. In May of 1921, the Queensland Synod and the United German and Scandinavian Synod voted to merge together to form the Queensland district of the ULCA. At this time, St Matthew's Lutheran Church Maryborough and St Andrew's Lutheran Church North Brisbane still remained independent. Now, as for the Danish Lutheran congregations in Queensland, as mentioned in Part A of this series, by 1896, the congregations had dwindled to only the Danish Lutheran congregation at Kangaroo Point. From the years of 1896 to 1910, the Danish Lutherans of Queensland were a part of the Scandinavian Lutherans in New Zealand. They were served by Pastor Bjelke Petersen, but in 1910, Pastor Bjelke Petersen returned to New Zealand and the Scandinavian Lutherans in New Zealand withdrew their support to Queensland. After New Zealand had withdrawn support, the congregation was once again independent from the years of 1910 to 1914. From the years of 1910 to 1912, they were served by Pastor Sass, and from 1912 to 1914, they were served by Pastor Menzing of the Elsa. In 1915, the congregation called Pastor Leigard from the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church of North America, or DELCNA. In 1918, the congregation moved from Kangaroo Point to Dock Street in order to start a mission to sailors. At that point, the congregation became the Queensland Mission of the DELCNA. In 1920, the DELCNA spread the Queensland Mission to congregations at Kingaroy and Maryborough. Since the 1921 amalgamation of the ULCA is such a major event, I'd like to pause at this point to give an update of the state of Lutheranism in Queensland, and to recap a list of the different Lutheran groups in the state of Queensland at this time. Thus, at the time of the 1921 amalgamation of the ULCA, the state of Lutheranism in Queensland was as followed. Number 1, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. Number 2, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, which still retained their fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The third division was St Matthew's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Maryborough. The fourth division was St Andrew's Independent Lutheran Congregation at North Brisbane, and the fifth was the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church of North America, Queensland Mission at Brisbane, Kingaroy and Maryborough. I do not wish to wrap up Part B at this point in time, as the history between 1921 and 1966 is a lot smaller, and so I'm going to continue on with this history to 1966. Following the amalgamation of the ULCA in 1921, there was still a few independent congregations in Queensland. As mentioned, they were the St Matthew's congregation at Maryborough and the St Andrew's congregation at North Brisbane. The situation of Maryborough is very simple, as they joined the ULCA in 1923. However, the history of St Andrew's North Brisbane is much more violent. After Pastor Truaz was interned in 1914, the congregation was served by another pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australasia, Pastor Johannes Friedrich Frank, who had come out of retirement in order to serve the congregations at North Brisbane and Maryborough. Since Pastor Truaz was then deported to Germany in 1918, Pastor Johannes Frank stayed at North Brisbane until his second retirement in 1920. At this point in time, the congregation then called Pastor Rudolf Mons, a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. In 1921, the Queensland Synod merged into the newly formed ULCA. However, despite Pastor Mons becoming a pastor of the ULCA, St Andrews remained as an independent congregation and was not officially considered a part of the ULCA. This became apparent in the year of 1923 when conflict arose within the congregation. The conflict arose when a number of members from St Andrews North Brisbane opted to join the ELSA. Those members who opposed this sought assistance from the ULCA. However, the ULCA declined assistance, stating that St. Andrews was not an official member of the ULCA, and therefore it was up to the individual congregation to decide whether they would join the ELSA or the ULCA. Disagreement between the pro-ELSA group and the pro-ULCA group went on for years, with the situation turning violent in 1927. In 1927, the pro-ELSA members decided to call an ELSA pastor, Pastor Theodore Reimers, to serve the congregation at North Brisbane. These same members also sought to remove Pastor Mons, not only from his call, but also from the manse as well. The congregation was thus divided into the Mons party, which was pro-ULCA, and the Reimers party, which was pro-ELSA. The conflicts grew beyond verbal and became physical, with the Reimers party taking control of the church building, thus forcing the Mons party to worship in the adjoining manse. The Reimers party made an overwhelming majority of the congregation. The conflict continued to escalate until April 4th, 1928, when the Reimers party forcibly removed Pastor Mons and his family from the manse. This resulted in a physical confrontation that night outside the manse between the Reimers party and the Mons party. A legal battle would finally settle the matter regarding the church and the manse property, with the court awarding the property of the church and the manse to the Mons party, which would finally join the ULCA in 1928. As for the Reimers party, which was the majority of the congregation, they joined the ELSA in 1928 and would later build the Bethlehem Lutheran Church North Brisbane in 1929. As for the history of the Danish Lutheran Church at this point, the Delkner's Queensland mission to Maryborough and Kingaroy was a flop. In 1923, the Delkner closed the Queensland mission and withdrew all support to Australia. The Danish congregation at Brisbane was once again independent. However, Pastor Liegard sought help from the State Church of Denmark, and the Brisbane congregation became a member of the Church of Denmark abroad. However, the congregation struggled to hold on, having to sell their property at Dock Street and began to worship in rented rooms. As for the ULCA and the ELSA, not much happened between the years of 1921 and 1966. As mentioned, the congregations of St. Matthew's Maryborough joined the ULCA in 1923, and in 1928, St. Andrew's North Brisbane joined the ULCA, with Bethlehem North Brisbane joining the ELSA. In 1935, the ULCA would join the informal International Fellowship of Lutheran Synods known as the Lutheran World Convention. In 1947, the Church of Sweden sought to replace the informal Lutheran World Convention with the more formally organized Lutheran World Federation. In 1944, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia would change their name to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, commonly known as the ELCA. As for the state of Lutheranism in Queensland, not much would change in this period of time. One point of interest is the Latvian Lutheran churches of Queensland. Following World War II, Latvian refugees fled to Australia, many of these being Lutherans. On May 2nd, 1951, the first Latvian Lutheran church would be established in Queensland, the Brisbane Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation. On October 14th, 1951, the second Latvian church in Queensland would be established, the Brisbane Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Mara Congregation. These two congregations were completely independent from each other. Over the 45-year period between 1921 to 1966, congregations around Australia would jump between the ELCA and the ULCA. In 1941, the ULCA and the ELCA, which at that point in time was still called the ELSA, began negotiations towards fellowship. A turn towards union took place at the ELCA's Pastoral Conference in 1948, held at Bethlehem Lutheran Church, Gindera, New South Wales. At this pastoral conference, the Synod adopted a new position on church fellowship, changing the meaning of the command of Romans chapter 16 verses 17 to 18 to mark and avoid those who cause division, to refer not to false teachers but to non-Christians. In addition, the ELCA voted to allow prayer fellowship, but not altar or pulpit fellowship, between the two synods. The two synods continued negotiations, drafting a joint document called the Theses of Agreement. The ULCA adopted the document in 1956 and the ELCA in 1959. However, a union was still postponed due to the synod's interaction with overseas Lutheran bodies. The ELCA was still in fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the ULCA was a member of the Lutheran World Federation. Both synods agreed to cut their overseas ties in order that a union could proceed in Australia. In 1965, the ULCA and the ELCA declared altar pulpit fellowship, and on October 29, 1966, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia united to form the Lutheran Church of Australia, commonly called the LCA. The Lutheran Church of Queensland was finally united into a single, unified Lutheran church body, not including the Danish and Latvian Lutherans. This would be the case except for the Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation, also known as the ELCRA. A number of ELCA pastors and congregations had originally opposed the Union of 1966. But when the union finally occurred, most of them just went along with the decision. However, one pastor, Pastor Frederick Kleinig, refused to be a part of this union. He was joined by a number of Lutheran congregations at Coombia, Mergen, Maryborough, Gympie and Woombye. In 1966, these congregations united and formed the Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation. At the time of the 1966 union of the LCA, the state of Lutheranism in Queensland was as followed. 1. The Lutheran Church of Australia. 2. The Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation. 3. The Church of Denmark Abroad, based in Brisbane. 4. The Brisbane Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation. And 5. The Brisbane Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Mara Congregation. With the largest union of Lutheran bodies in Australian history, we finish Part B of our history on Lutheranism in Queensland. I hope you have enjoyed this video on a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland from 1900 to 1966. Stay tuned for Part C of this series when we discuss the side effects of the 1966 Union and we look at the brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland from the years of 1966 to 2017. Thank you for watching this video. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Goodbye and God bless.